When mom thinks being gay is a sin. The small town of Santa Fe was surrounded by mountains, one of those communities where time seemed to move slowly, as if each morning were merely a repetition of the last. The church bells rang religiously at 6 in the evening, and the streets were always quiet, except for the occasional laughter of children and the sound of gates closing in the houses around. Lucia, 43, was a well-known and respected figure in the town. She actively participated in church activities and held an important position in the religious community. To everyone, she was the example of faith and morality, always ready to help those in need and keep her family on the right path. She became a widow at a young age and never showed interest in another man, believing that even with Ernesto's absence in her life, it would be a betrayal. She raised Rodrigo, her only son, practically alone, living modestly on the pension left by Ernesto, but instilling the same values, ensuring he was always involved in church activities and followed the principles she cherished. Rodrigo, on the other hand, was different. At 16, he was a quiet, introspective young man who often preferred the silence of his own room to social excitement. From an early age, Lucia noticed he wasn't like the other boys, but she attributed this to his quieter personality. Still, she believed he, like all young people, would find his place within the norms of the town and the church. The relationship between mother and son seemed good on the surface, but there was a growing emotional distance that Lucia couldn't fully understand. She imagined it was something temporary, perhaps part of adolescence or related to the absence of his father. What she didn't know was the immense weight Rodrigo carried every day, a truth about himself that he had yet to reveal. Rodrigo had known for a long time that he was gay, but in small-town Santa Fe, where the church walls seemed to stretch throughout the town, this was a truth hard to share. If accepting this truth was complicated for him and had to be built gradually, imagine for the people in that place. From childhood, when adults made those silly jokes about boys playing with girls, the teasing began. Look at the little lovebirds, which was unbearable for Rodrigo. He couldn't even imagine holding hands with a girl. On the other hand, he enjoyed admiring some of his male classmates. It was a delightful feeling, but it took him time to understand. For a long time, he thought he was dirty for his thoughts and interests, a sinner who needed healing and salvation, especially when he heard his mother discussing the matter with her church friends. They spoke of those men with indignation, calling them sinners and even abominations, saying it was the work of the enemy, which added even more weight to Rodrigo's burden. They asserted that such individuals wouldn't be saved and wouldn't dwell with God, and Rodrigo already pictured himself burning in hell. However, as he grew older and gained more understanding of what was happening, he began to realize that those feelings weren't a choice. He was this way, period. He was born this way, and there wouldn't be any salvation in the world that could change that. It was a Sunday like any other, and the church was full. Families from Santa Fe filled the pews, all attentive to the pastor's words. Lucia sat in the third row, as usual, with Rodrigo by her side. She felt proud to be there, believing that her role as a devoted mother was being fulfilled by bringing her son into God's embrace. The sermon that morning, however, felt heavier than usual. The pastor, a man with a deep voice and imposing posture, began to speak about the dangers of modern immorality. The words he chose seemed to hit directly at Rodrigo's deepest fears. He spoke of how the youth were being seduced by external influences, abandoning the right path and falling into the temptations of sin. Nowadays, we are surrounded by deviations from conduct, by paths that lead our families away from the Word of God, the pastor said, his voice echoing through the walls of the temple. The youth is being corrupted by ideologies that distort what God intended for man and woman. We must pray for our families to remain on the path of morality and purity. Rodrigo felt his heart race with each word. It was as if the pastor knew his secret, as if he were pointing directly at him. He glanced at his mother, who was focused, nodding in approval. For Lucia, those words reaffirmed everything she believed. For Rodrigo, they were a cruel reminder that he would never be accepted if he revealed who he truly was. The sermon continued, and each phrase made Rodrigo shrink further into his seat. When the service finally ended, he quickly stood up, a avoiding his mother's gaze and the trivial conversations that followed every Sunday. The walk home was silent. Lucia seemed satisfied, while Rodrigo was restless. The weight of those words echoed in his mind. Something had shifted within him that day. He knew he couldn't keep hiding his truth. The need to reveal his identity was growing, but the fear of losing his mother's love kept him silent. Rodrigo understood that he couldn't face this alone for much longer. In a small town like Santa Fe, trusting anyone was a risk, but he had a friend he could lean on, Rafael. He was a year older than Rodrigo and had left the church some time ago, causing murmurs among the townspeople. Rafael had always been more rebellious, but Rodrigo knew that this rebellion was actually a way to escape the town's suffocating expectations. That afternoon, after the service, Rodrigo sent a message to Rafael, asking to meet him at the town park. They used to meet there, away from prying eyes, a refuge for more intimate conversations. Sitting on a bench beneath an old tree, Rodrigo finally opened up about what he felt during the sermon. He described the weight of the pastor's words, how they had made him feel even more out of place and trapped. "I can't take hiding this anymore. But I don't know what to do. My mom will never understand," Rodrigo confessed, his voice trembling slightly. Rafael listened intently, nodding. He knew what it was like to grow under the pressure of religion and social expectations. "You know I'm leaving in a few months, right?" Rafael said, breaking the silence. "I can't stand this town anymore. Here, you'll never be who you really are." Those words echoed in Rodrigo's mind. Rafael was right. The city felt suffocating, and he increasingly sensed the need to free himself from the prison he had built around himself. Rafael encouraged Rodrigo to be honest with his mother, no matter how painful it might be. "You have to be true to her, and to yourself. If she loves you, she'll find a way to deal with it." Rodrigo knew Rafael was right, but fear still held him back. However, that conversation planted a seed of courage within him, and he began to seriously consider the possibility of telling the truth. After talking with Rafael, Rodrigo couldn't think of anything else. His friend's words echoed in his mind like a constant reminder that he needed to act. Deep down, he knew it was time to face what he had been postponing for so long. Each passing day made the secret feel heavier, and the silence became unbearable. In the following weeks, Rodrigo tried to focus on his school routine and home activities, but everything felt different now. He could no longer escape the truth. Whenever Lucia spoke about the future, about college, about finding a good girl to date, Rodrigo felt an unbearable pressure in his chest. The need to be honest with his mother grew with every conversation. He spent hours in his room, mentally rehearsing what he would say. He tried to imagine how his mother would react, and how he could explain it in a way she would understand. At times, he filled himself with courage, believing he could tell her everything. But just one word or gesture from Lucia would send him retreating. The fear of losing her love and acceptance haunted him the most. One night, while staring at the ceiling of his room, Rodrigo made the definitive decision. He could no longer live in fear. He could no longer continue hiding such an essential part of who he was. He needed to tell her, not just for himself, but because he deserved to live his truth. He knew he could lose her support, but he was willing to take that risk. In the days that followed, anxiety grew. He began looking for the right moment to speak, but it seemed like there would never be an ideal time. Still, Rodrigo knew the moment was close. The table was set, as it was every Sunday night. Lucia had prepared a simple dinner, but made with love, and Rodrigo had helped her arrange the plates. The atmosphere was calm, at least on the surface. For Lucia, this was just another family meal. For Rodrigo, however, it was the beginning of something much larger. He could hardly swallow the little he put on his plate. His stomach was in knots, and each time he tried to look at his mother, fear would seize him. Deep down, he knew there was no perfect moment for a revelation like this. He had to do it now, or the weight of the secret would crush him. Between bites, Lucia casually started a conversation, mentioning a sermon at church. "Do you remember what the pastor said that Sunday?" "He really knows how to touch on important themes," she commented, her eyes shining with the confidence of someone who was sure of her values. "We need to stay strong, Rodrigo. The world is filled with temptations that steer us off the right path. Her words were the spark Rodrigo needed. He took a deep breath, feeling his heart race in his chest. His hands trembled slightly, and his mouth felt dry, but he knew he couldn't wait any longer. "Mom," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to tell you something." Lucia looked at him, noticing for the first time the tension on her son's face. She set her fork aside and leaned slightly forward, as if she were about to hear something important. The air in the room seemed to change, and the silence between them grew thicker. Rodrigo averted his gaze for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts, but there was no way to soften the impact. He knew the truth had to come out as it was, simple, clear, and definitive. "Mom, I'm gay." The words, though rehearsed countless times, seemed to echo in the heavy air of the dining room. Rodrigo looked directly into his mother's eyes, watching as her expression slowly shifted from shock to confusion. Time seemed to slow, and the silence that followed felt like a wall between them, tall and impenetrable. Lucia remained silent for a few seconds, as if processing what she had just heard. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. When she finally spoke, her voice was fragile, almost inaudible. "Rodrigo, what are you saying?" She seemed to struggle to comprehend. "Are you sure? This can't be." Rodrigo felt his chest tighten further. He knew his mother's reaction wouldn't be easy, but hearing the doubt in her voice felt like a stab. "Yes, Mom, I'm sure. I've been this way for as long as I can remember. It's not a phase, and it's not something that's going to change." Lucia shook her head slightly, as if trying to push away her confusion. "This can't be true. We raised you with values, Rodrigo. This isn't part of what God planned for our family." He had expected this reaction, but it didn't make the situation any less painful. He looked at her with tears in his eyes, but remained resolute. "I know what you believe, Mom, but this is who I am. I can't change, and I don't want to hide who I am anymore." Lucia stood up from the table abruptly, tears now streaming down her face. She started pacing back and forth in the kitchen, lost in thoughts and conflicting emotions. "I raised you with so much love, Rodrigo. How can this be happening? I always did my best to teach you right, to guide you on the path that God wants for us. How can I accept this? Hell." Rodrigo watched his mother, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. He knew that this internal battle would be long and painful for both of them. He felt his own pain, but he also saw hers, a mother who felt lost in her beliefs, unable to understand what this meant for their future. "Mom, I know it's hard. I know this goes against everything you believe, but I need you to understand. I am still the same son you've always loved. None of this changes who I am. I am still Rodrigo, your son." Lucia stopped, turning to him with an expression of pain. "But you're asking me to change everything I believe, everything I've lived for all these years. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can accept this. How will I deal with this at church? And what will people say?" Rodrigo felt the weight of his mother's words, but he tried to remain calm. "I'm not asking you to abandon your faith. I just want you to accept me as I am. I know it will take time, but I need you to know that I can't change this, and I won't try." Lucia looked at him for a long moment, her face a mix of confusion, pain, and love. She seemed about to say something, but couldn't. Instead, she slowly walked away, still unable to process the truth. Silence once again filled the room, and Rodrigo felt the distance between them grow. He remained seated at the table, watching his mother leave. He knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The silence that lingered in the air seemed heavy with a sadness they both shared, yet somehow it separated them even more. The days that followed the revelation were marked by an almost unbearable silence. Lucia and Rodrigo barely spoke, and the house, which used to be filled with small, everyday conversations, became a space of solitary reflection. Lucia spent much of her time immersed in household chores, but Rodrigo could feel that her mind was elsewhere. The distant look in her eyes, the way she avoided talking about anything other than trivial matters, all indicated that she was still processing. Lucia isolated herself from everything and everyone, including her friends from church. She had stopped attending daily services, something that had never happened before. Rodrigo noticed but didn't ask anything. He knew his mother was battling a whirlwind of emotions. The revelation had broken something inside her, and time seemed to be the only thing that could help restore or at least mend this rupture. During this time, Lucia reflected deeply on her faith and beliefs. She tried to pray, but the words that came out of her mouth didn't seem to carry the same weight. There was a barrier between her and the certainty she had always had about what was right and wrong. How could she reconcile the love she felt for her son with the religious convictions that had sustained her life until that moment? She sought advice from friends at church, but the answers were all cold and predictable. They said she should pray for Rodrigo, that he would find his way back to God in time. Some were more radical, saying she should kick her son out of the house, claiming she couldn't accept such a sin in her home. None of this, however, eased the tightness in her heart. It was easy to follow ready-made answers, but Lucia knew her situation was more complex. She couldn't look at Rodrigo and think he was lost, or that her love for him could be conditional upon a change in something so essential. Meanwhile, Rodrigo tried to live life as normally as possible. He spent time with Rafael and studied, but the tension between him and his mother was constant. He wanted her acceptance, but he also understood that this acceptance would take time. Deep down, he feared that his mother would never be able to see him beyond her religious beliefs. The silence between them was suffocating, but Rodrigo knew he couldn't rush the reconciliation. They were both trapped in their own internal struggles, each dealing with the truth in different ways. Lucia needed to find a way to reconcile her beliefs with the love she felt for her son. Now, in her prayers, instead of asking God to free her son from the enemy and take Rodrigo out of sin, she began to ask God to help her love her son just as he is. And Rodrigo, no matter how much he wished for swift acceptance, knew that the journey toward mutual understanding would be slow and painful. One night, after days of silence and distance, Lucia finally gathered her courage. She knew she couldn't keep fleeing from this new reality. She needed to talk to Rodrigo. She didn't have all the answers and was still confused and lost in her own beliefs. But what she knew for certain was that she loved him. And that love, somehow, had to be greater than anything conflicting within her. Lucia gently knocked on Rodrigo's bedroom door. When he let her enter, she approached cautiously, as if each movement carried weight. Rodrigo, lying on the bed, sat up, sensing that something different was about to happen. The silence that had followed their routine conversations seemed to dissipate a bit. Lucia sat beside her son, still at a loss for words, but the gesture was enough for Rodrigo to feel that a small wall had been torn down. "Rodrigo," she began, her voice faltering slightly. I'm still trying to understand all of this. I'm still confused. I won't lie to you. My heart is in conflict with many things, with what I believe, with what I've always taught you. But," she paused, searching for the right words, "that doesn't change the fact that you are my son. I love you, and I want to try." Rodrigo, who had been bracing himself for more silence or withdrawal, felt an unexpected relief wash over him. It was as if, for the first time since revealing the truth, his mother was genuinely trying to listen to him, trying to understand. "Mom, I don't expect you to understand everything at once. I know this is hard for you, but I just need you to know that I can't change, and I never wanted to hurt you." Lucia nodded, gently holding Rodrigo's hand. The contact was small, but deeply significant. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed, tears welling in her eyes. "I grew up believing in so many things, and now I need to learn to see the world differently. But I want to try, because I can't lose you." Lucia's words, though filled with hesitation, brought a wave of emotion to Rodrigo. He knew that there was still a long way to go, but this moment of mutual vulnerability was an important step toward the reconciliation he longed for. "Thank you, Mom. That means a lot to me." They stood there in silence, but this time it was different. No longer was it the void of unspoken words, but rather a space where understanding began to sprout, even if it was still fragile and uncertain. The reconciliation was not complete, and full acceptance might take time. But that night, Lucia and Rodrigo took a step towards something new. A love that, despite the difficulties, was beginning to grow with more honesty, rooted in respect for their differences and the strength of a bond that would never be entirely broken. The next morning, something subtle had changed. The sun streamed through the windows of the house, and for the first time in days, Rodrigo and Lucia had breakfast together without the suffocating weight of silence. They still had much to discuss, much to learn about each other, but there was a lightness in the air that hadn't existed before. It was as if they were slowly learning to walk side by side again. Lucia looked at Rodrigo, this time with a softer, more understanding gaze. "Shall we go to church today?" she asked, without her usual firmness. Rodrigo looked at her, hesitating, but then smiled gently. "I'll go with you," he replied, knowing that this small gesture was part of the reconciliation process. As they walked together through the streets of Santa Fe, the world around them seemed the same, but for them, something had profoundly changed. Lucia knew that she would still face challenges with her beliefs and what the community thought, but above all, she was willing to learn, to accept, and to grow. And Rodrigo, despite the uncertainties, felt that the love he shared with his mother, though wounded, was slowly healing. The journey of acceptance and understanding between mother and son was just beginning, but they were ready to face it, together. Did you enjoy the story? If this narrative touched you in some way, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like, and share it with your friends. This is just one of the many heartfelt stories we're sharing here. Let's spread messages of love, acceptance, and understanding to as many people as possible.